Here they are under attack by the world's greatest military power. They have no defense of their own, and yet it appeared that God was weighing in for them. You see, so many of them talk. Here's another great example. Silas Deane. You see this picture of the first prayer in Congress. Well, that window at the back, over on the right side of the window, there are three faces raised heavenward as they pray. The man in the middle is Silas Deane. And in his writings, he said, after this time of prayer, he said, even the stern old Quakers had tears running down their cheeks. And this is 1774. This is how this thing started out. You don't hear anything about that today. We're told it was all about money and greed and economics. Now, there were spiritual principles that were undergirding everything that went on, and it's very clear in the records. Matter of fact, in 1775, an interesting incident happened with Ethan Allen. Ethan Allen, his Green Mountain Boys, he was approached by citizens in the legislature of Connecticut. Connecticut was really scared. They said, man, here we are between Virginia and Massachusetts. British troops have gone into Williamsburg in Virginia. British troops are going through Lexington, Concord, Charleston, Boston, Bunker Hill. We're scared to death they're going to come into Connecticut next, and we don't know what we're going to do. Ethan, would you take your Green Mountain Boys and go over here to New York, way inland, go to Ticonderoga and capture Fort Ticonderoga? Now, the logic was, this is so far away from the action that if we capture that British fort, maybe the British will think that we're going to attack their forts, and they'll have to keep all their British troops at all these forts rather than send them out to attack the Americans. So Ethan took Green Mountain Boys. They surrounded that fort in May of 1775. It was late at night. Poor British didn't know anything was coming. I mean, this is a long way from any scene of action. And so they knocked out the guards. There were 2 guards. They knocked them out. They tied them up. They got the rest of the barracks. This was late at night, coming up toward midnight. And they got the rest of the barracks. And then Ethan Allen, after having secured the whole fort, went and banged on the door of the commandant, Captain de la Place. And Captain de la Place, being the proper British soldier that he was, didn't like being awakened in the middle of the night. So he came storming to the door and he says, "Who is this? What do you demand?" And Ethan Allen says, "I order you to surrender your fort." Now, that's something to wake up to in the middle of the night. You didn't know anything was happening, and now somebody's got your fort. It's this ragtag American stuff. They've got the fort, and you're told to give up your fort, and you're a commander in the greatest military in the world. And Captain de la Place became indignant, and he says, "By whose authority do you order me to give up my fort?" Ethan Allen, in his own autobiography, he took a step back, he raised his sword in the air, and Ethan Allen said, "In the name of the great Jehovah and the Continental Congress." And it was that declaration, the great Jehovah and the Continental Congress, got the attention of the British commander. He promptly gave him the fort on the spot, not a single shot fired. They captured the fort without any loss of life. But that declaration, in the name of the great Jehovah and the Continental Congress, was such a profound declaration that you can go to the Capitol today and find a statue of Ethan Allen inside the U.S. Capitol. What placed him there? What made him a hero in the American Revolution? That declaration, in the name of the great Jehovah and the Continental Congress. Under God and under Congress, I order you to give up your fort. You see, nobody hears that about Ethan Allen anymore, but that was the declaration made then. And even as you look at the symbols that were coming up then, because 1775, we're in our second year of conflict, we're under attack, the symbolism that we started having at that point in time. For example, the Massachusetts Navy, the state had its own Navy. Now, we didn't think like a nation back then. Each of these 13 states were like 13 separate nations, and we weren't thinking like a unified nation, so the state had its own Navy. Well, the Massachusetts Navy, its flag was fairly interesting. This is right out of the Massachusetts order on what the flag would be. It says, "Resolved that the uniform of the naval officers be green, and that they furnish themselves accordingly, and that the colors be a white flag with a green pine tree, and the inscription, 'Appeal to Heaven.'" That was the flag of the Navy. We appeal to heaven. We are defending ourselves, and we ask God to intervene on our behalf. He will decide who's right and wrong in this conflict. The other Massachusetts flag for the land forces was an appeal to God. So you had an appeal to heaven, an appeal to God, and you'll find that even on the currency of the American Revolution, and again, there was no federal currency. Each state had its own currency. You look at, for example, North Carolina's currency. North Carolina has a Bible that's open on its currency, has a crown over the Bible. Now, we're getting rid of a king, right? So we're getting rid of this crown, and on the currency it says, "The Bible is our king." See, no more King George III. The Bible is going to be what will govern us. We're out from under this divine right of king stuff where that only one guy hears from God on our behalf. In South Carolina, the currency there had a hand with a sword in it raised to heaven, and it said, "Under God Almighty." And that was victory. That was the symbol of victory, was under God, we can win. So it was a lot like the Hebrew children says, that we're going to stand for what's right and God will intervene in our half, but if He doesn't intervene in our half, we're still going to stand for what's right. So that was the symbols that you saw early in the American Revolution, even on the flags, the money, etc. Now, there's an interesting incident that happened in 1776 and 1777. 1776, one of the members of the Virginia legislature, now remember, Virginia's been under attack, one of the members of the Virginia legislature was a minister. He was the Reverend John Peter Gabriel Muhlenberg. He pastored two churches on the opposite end of the state from where the legislature was. He pastored churches over in Woodstock, Virginia. He actually pastored a German-speaking Lutheran church and an English-speaking Episcopal church. Well, in January of that year, he had just heard the report of Patrick Henry and that he had to rally 5,000 Virginia troops to push back the British. And so as Pastor Muhlenberg heads home, he gets to this remote, secluded part of the state where his churches are, a long way across the state. And he preached on January the 21st, that Sunday, what became his farewell sermon. Now, his congregations didn't know it then, but it was his farewell sermon. And he stood there in his clerical robes that morning, and he preached out of Ecclesiastes 3, verses 1 through 8, which is the passage about, there's a time and a season, purpose to everything. Time to be born, time to die. Well, he went through all this, and he got down to verse 8. And verse 8 says there's a time of peace and a time of war. Now, he just explained to his congregation what was happening. We're in a time of war, and here's what's happening, and Virginia's under attack. And again, this is still months before the Declaration of Independence. So here he gets to verse 8. This is a time of peace and a time of war. And he closed his Bible, and he put his finger out, and he said, "Brethren," he said, "this is not the time of peace." He said, "This is the time of war." And then he bowed his head, and he had a dismissal prayer. But after that, instead of doing what he always did, and that was to go off into the vestry room and take his robes off, his clerical robes and chains there, he stood right in front of the congregation, started disrobing in front of the congregation. And when he jerked off those clerical robes, underneath those robes, he was wearing the full uniform of an officer in the Continental Army, sword and everything. He started marching down the aisle of that church. There was one aisle down the middle of the church. He marched down that aisle, and he preached as he went. He said, "Brethren," he said, "we came here to practice our religious and our civil liberties. And if we don't get involved, we're going to lose those liberties." He said, "Now who's going with me to defend those liberties?" Well, 300 men got up and met him at the back door of that church. Those 300 men became known as the 8th Virginia Brigade. You'd be surprised how many brigades in the American Revolution were nothing more than ministers leading their congregations out to defend their rights. Now, that was not all that unusual. You go back to the Minutemen. You remember the Minutemen, the great folk heroes, Lexington, Concord? Well, who was the leader of the Minutemen? Well, Jonas Clark. Well, who's Jonas Clark? Well, he was the Reverend Jonas Clark. Well, who were the Minutemen? Well, they were the deacons who followed him out of the church to defend the town. You see, this was quite common in the American Revolution. Now, Reverend John Peter Gabriel Muhlenberg, this ordained minister, went on to become one of the highest-ranking military officers in the American Revolution. He was Major General John Peter Muhlenberg. Now, Major General Muhlenberg, there were only 17 major generals at the end of the American Revolution. He was one of them, one of Washington's most trusted generals. Now, it's interesting. Now, this all happened in 1776. He had a brother, and by the way, if you go to the U.S. Capitol, there is a statue, a big marble statue of John Peter Gabriel Muhlenberg right there in the Capitol, showing him taking off his clerical robes and showing the uniform under it with the sword. It's depicted right there, this minister of the gospel standing up to fight for their rights. So he has this brother. Now, his brother was pastoring in New York City, and his brother wrote him a scathing letter. And I mean, he just absolutely chewed him up. And his brother was Frederick Augustus Muhlenberg. So Frederick, the brother, who's the pastor in New York, writes Brother Peter, who was pastoring in Virginia, has now left the pulpit to get involved. And Frederick tells his brother, he said, "You would have acted for the best if you'd kept out of this business from the beginning." He said, "I now give you my thoughts in brief. I think you're wrong." And that's just about as brief as it gets. He said, "Brother, you shouldn't have done this. You're supposed to stay in the pulpit. You shouldn't be getting involved in this kind of stuff." Well, Brother Peter wrote back a letter. He said, "Wow," he said, "that was a pretty scathing letter you wrote, pretty serious stuff." And he said, "You've accused me of getting involved and that I shouldn't because I'm a clergyman." This is what he said. He said, "I am a clergyman. It is true. But I'm a member of society as well as the poorest layman, and my liberty is as dear to me as it is to any man." He said, "Shall I then sit still?" He said, "Heaven forbid it." He said, "I'm convinced it's my duty so to do, and duty I owe to God and my country." And then he started meddling with his brother. He said, "Oh, by the way," he said, "Frederick," he said, "do you realize you couldn't stand in your pulpits and do what you're doing? You couldn't stand there and preach the gospel if it wasn't for people like me going out to defend your right to preach the gospel?" And Frederick, yeah, right. Just kind of blew it off. Well, interesting thing happened in 1777, the next year. The British invaded New York City. They came into New York City. They seized his brother's church. They seized Frederick's church. They desecrated his church. They chased him out of the pulpit. And suddenly, this minister of the gospel, Frederick, who said you shouldn't be involved, has lost his church, lost his ministry. It's been taken over. He says, "Maybe I ought to get involved after all."